So we're talking about roughly 1.25 billion barrels that were never produced and delivered to market. We're not getting closer to normal, we're getting further away. That was the war game. Trump swallowed Netanyahu's analysis hook, line, and sinker, and then never even bothered to run a backup check. So now they have no choice but to build a nuke. So if we do just withdraw, they'll have a nuke in under a year.
You're watching the Financial Sense News Hour. Financial news for high net worth investors and strategists. When it comes to the biggest investment trends and understanding the market, we've been delivering the insights you need for over 30 years.
Well, there's hope. We finally come to a peace agreement. A lot of questions is, will that actually hold? So we're going to be discussing what's going on with Iran and what's the likely outcome. Joining me on the program is Peter Zeihan. He's one of the world's foremost geopolitical strategists, combining a deep understanding of geography, demography, and energy, which is why I wanted to have him on the show. You know, Peter, one of the things that strikes me is you signed a peace agreement. I guess magically those billion barrels of oil we've lost magically appear. Nobody seems to be talking about that. So let's begin with that of how much we've lost. And I'm looking at a graph on my Bloomberg. I got a graph of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, lowest it's been since 83. I've got inventories at Cushing below 20 million barrels where future contracts are settled. And we got oil prices down today.
Let's start by saying I have no idea what's going on with oil prices, and I'm not that kind of analyst. But yes, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. We have been down somewhere between 10 and 14 million barrels per day. The numbers keep getting squishy for the better part of 4 months. So we're talking about roughly 1.25 billion barrels that were never produced and delivered to market. Now, there's all kinds of fine print within that. So, for example, the Saudis were able to redirect almost all of their crude exports to their Yanbu port via the Petro line, which crosses the peninsula. The Emiratis were able to redirect a good portion of their exports to the Fujairah pipe because they also have a bypass system. But Qatar has taken extreme damage. Some of the UAE fields have taken damage. Iraq is a real problem, and Kuwait is completely offline. What people are hoping for now is that step one, the production that has been sitting in storage tanks in the ports can now get out. And that's going to be a big shot in the arm, no argument. Step two, they're hoping that all of the fields that were offline can now start production in a matter of days to weeks. That is overly optimistic. That's the part that we know. The part that we don't know is the Chinese don't produce a lot of statistics anymore about anything. And the Russian shadow fleet has always been a bit of a dark hole. So there's a lot of wiggle room in all of this data, but it's really hard to add up all of the mitigating factors and hit 1 billion barrels. So yeah, I'm still expecting a bit of an oil crunch, if not a full-on crisis, if not a full-on energy-induced depression over the course of the summer, as it becomes obvious that all of these little patches here and there just aren't enough.
And when you take a look at it, I want to bring up even insurance rates. If I was Lloyd's of London, I mean, the president signed the peace agreement, and a week later they were shooting at each other. So if I was Lloyd's of London, I don't know if I'd want to insure a tanker going through the Gulf right now. And if I did, the rates are going to add a significant cost to the price of oil, not to mention the fact that they want to charge fees now to go through the straits.
Actually, Jim, I'm not too worried about the insurance thing. I mean, it's a real cost. I don't mean to minimize that. But there's a huge difference between high costs, but you can get the crude, and you just can't get the crude. One of them requires an economic adjustment, whether it's with lending or a little moving around in your balance sheet or coming up with money that you save from somewhere else. And the other one is just not possible. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release that the US did in conjunction with everyone else in the OECD did buy us a minimum 35 days, and that's great, but it's now been 4 months, and that flow is completely gone. We don't have a good read at the moment, or at least I don't have a good read at the moment, as to how much storage is available in the Persian Gulf. I believe it's about another 60 to 80 million barrels, but I'm not 100% sure on that. What we need to be watching for is crude carriers going into the Gulf. because we had 1,000 ships trapped in, and most of the traffic that we have seen in the last month since the peace deal was about getting those ships out. And yes, they bring crude with them. But until tankers go back in, we haven't reestablished any of the actual flows. Now, on June 30th, for the first time, 5 VLCCs did go in, about half of what is normal. But then they were shooting later in the day, and that stopped, and we didn't have any yesterday. So until we get to a position where we have at least 8, preferably 10 to 12, going in every single day, able to load up and come out without being molested, we're not getting closer to normal. We're getting further away.
So let me bring up something. If I was a country, and especially some of those countries in Asia where they went to rationing,
Mm.
seeing that the way this conflict and peace deal is held up, I would want to maybe replenish my reserves. And of course, the big question was China. I think they had about 1.5 billion barrels going into this, and they weren't importing as much. So that kind of helped. But if I was China, if I was any other country, I would want to build my reserves because it doesn't look like the shooting is going to be permanent anytime soon.
Yeah, no, the problem is if you want to fill your reserves, I mean, that's obviously wise, but you're supposed to do that before there's a shortage. So there's really nowhere you can pull them from now. And a couple of the normal sources that the world would reach to just aren't available or probably aren't going to be available very soon. So in number one, you've got Venezuela. Luckily, the earthquakes did not damage the oil production, but they took out the power grid. And without the power grid, you can't lift the crude in the Orinoco. You can't process it so you can fit into a pipeline. You can't pump it through a pipeline to the port. And you can't load it at the port. So for the moment, Venezuela's million barrels per day are offline. And then second is the Russians. The Ukrainians have fielded a new type of drone where the terminal guidance is decided on board from a decision tree that you load into memory, which means it can't be jammed. It can only be kinetically intercepted, and that's much more difficult, especially when there's 100 of them coming at you. So in this moment, the Ukrainians have stopped going after the ports and are going after the entire refinery backbone because the Russians actually refine more product than they export in crude. And that is forcing pressure to build up throughout the pipeline network and with the intent of forcing the Russians to actually shut in production at the source. It's been pretty successful. And so while crude exports from Russia have actually gone up in the last 30 days, there's a very real danger that by the end of the summer, the Russians won't be producing nearly as much crude as they used to because they have no ability to process it within their own system. And so just as it becomes obvious that the Persian Gulf situation is actually nowhere near over, the Russians might fall off of the market.
Well, I know there was a oil conference where you had executives from Chevron and Exxon talking about much higher prices. And then, of course, we had the peace deal, and the media said, okay, we're going back to 50, $60 oil. And I just don't know if we're going to see this peace hold. What's your take on this from a geopolitical point of view?
Well, let's hit it from 3 different angles. So, first of all, the Israeli angle. Netanyahu is an embattled leader who is not particularly popular in his own country. And the reason he's been at the forefront of Israeli politics for so long, he's just been very, very good at building coalitions with people that, let's just say, the mainstream doesn't necessarily care for. So, for him, having the looming threat of war, regardless of why, is actually really good for his political future. And so, if there are elections later this year, which is supposedly the plan, he has a vested interest in making sure that this is as hot as possible. So, the Israelis are definitely, excuse me, Benjamin Netanyahu is definitely on the warpath for personal reasons. Number two, the Iranians, they have emerged from this conflict with a consolidated leadership and more geopolitical reach than they had going in. The last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, has been really rough for the Islamic Republic. They've seen Hezbollah detoothed. They've seen the American sanction system really hurt their economy. And they basically were having an ever shrinking pool of power to draw from. Now, because the Israelis and the Americans assassinated some of the political leadership, which were the moderates, I might add, and now the hardliners are in power without any limitations from other political factions, they're able to do things that they couldn't do before. And they really don't care about the population because they control multi hundreds of thousands of a soldier's force that they can use to oppress their own population that they do very well. And now it's an open discussion in the world about Iran charging tolls or service fees or whatever, giving them leverage that they've never had before. And the fact that a couple of the Arab states, most notably the UAE, have been grudgingly siding with the Israelis has really opened up the Arab street around the world to a pro-Iranian position. So yes, Iran got bombed. Yes, Iran took a lot of damage that'll take them a decade to recover from. Strategically, they're in a much better spot now than they were back at the beginning of February. And then you've got the United States. When Trump was president the first time, he was kind of surprised that he won. He really expected to spend the rest of his days lambasting Hillary Clinton for beating him, and that was his shtick. So when he won, he didn't have any staff in waiting to take over the cabinet positions or any of the senior positions in the government. So the Republican Party was tapped for people who followed Republican orthodoxy. And what Trump very quickly discovered in less than 3 months is that these people broadly knew what they were doing and they were very knowledgeable. And so whenever Trump was in a room with any of them, he hated it because he wasn't the smartest person in the room and he had to sit and listen. So he fired more cabinet secretaries in his first term than any three American presidents in history, including the two-termers. While he was out of power, to make sure that that could never happen again, he went over, he took control of the Republican Party apparatus, and he destroyed the recruitment arm so no talented people could rise up to challenge him. And he destroyed the policy arm so he would always be the smartest person in the room. And then when he won the second time, he didn't tap the Republican Party or what was left of it for staff. He only tapped the people who had sucked up to him in the 4 years he was out of power. So he is surrounded by the least capable, least knowledgeable, most sycophantic leadership in American history. And so when Netanyahu showed up at the White House on February 11 to make the same pitch that he had made to four other presidents to get the United States to fight a war for him, Trump thought it was a great idea, and there was no one in the room to say otherwise. And the carriers were given the order that day to sail. That's all the deliberation that was done. And then the second they arrived in the region, the war started. So Trump is not using the CIA to inform him. He is not using the State Department to lead or participate in negotiations. It's just him. And so some horrible mistakes are being made. And this week is when we finally maybe start real negotiations. We haven't even had an American in the room for the talks to this point because Trump doesn't trust anybody.
So, given that and the fragileness of this whole agreement, what can come out of this? If he doesn't have really the right people, what's the outcome?
In Trump's own words, the talks are becoming boring, and he just wants to be done with them. I mean, that's pretty much a direct quote. And so if you look at the text of the deal as it currently exists, Iran gets a $300 billion compensation fund. Iran has all the sanctions lifted. Iran has the blockade lifted. Iran gets technical assistance. Iran can keep its nuclear program. Iran can, after 60 days, start tolling the Persian Gulf. Trump just wants out, and he doesn't care how. He doesn't care about the long-term damage at all, regardless of who that might be to. So we basically have the United States, who does own the naval hammer of the world, but it's wielded by someone who really is completely disinterested in what happens the next day. So that could mean another round of strikes, although we're running out of long-range munitions. We used over half of what we had in the war, which makes the next war that much more complicated, separate topic. I think it's more likely that the United States just declares victory, packs up and goes home, and leaves this region to do whatever is going to happen. And if that is how this goes, then there is no way it is ever returning to exporting 20 million barrels of crude a day, because the Iranians have already proven that not just can they close the strait, they already have the range to hit the ports at the end of those bypass pipelines in Fujairah, in the UAE, and at Yanbu on the Red Sea. So if the Iranians choose to, for whatever reason, however this goes, they can actually take it all offline.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was a bypass. The Saudis and a couple other of the countries have been bypassing by pipelines, but pipelines are susceptible to drone attacks.
And the Iranians hit the petrol line in Saudi Arabia a couple times just to prove that they could. They also hit the loading facility in Yanbu just to prove that they could. Same in Fujairah.
And they also hit our military bases in the region too.
Yeah, now details on that are sketchy for national security reasons, obviously, but it looks like specifically the facility in Bahrain took a lot of damage. Most Iranian drones, most Shaheds, don't even have optics. They follow the equivalent of a GPS transponder, and they just fly in a straight line from launch to crash. That's it. They're dumb. That doesn't mean they're harmless, God no. But there's only so much they can do. But as the Ukrainians have shown us starting in late February and especially into March, there's a new type of drone out, a memory drone, where you can load in a decision tree and you have some optics. And when the drone reaches the zone that you assign it, it looks around, it sees what it can see, it plays it against its decision tree, it makes one decision once, it targets that one thing, and then it can't be jammed. Best guess is that the Iranians had at least a couple of dozen of those, and those were the ones that were used to hit the US facilities because the US facilities are obviously under jamming. A GPS driven drone should have no chance of hitting anything there. And they didn't just strike, they hit with precision on very sensitive positions, things like radars. That does not happen in a contested EM environment.
So, given this, what's I guess Trump wants to, you have the midterms coming up, and I can see
I
why
don't
he
think he
want to
cares.
walk away. He doesn't want to be dropping bombs come October. That's
I
not going
really
to
don't
go
think he
over well.
cares. I
Really?
mean, the chances of the Democrats getting a two-thirds majority in the House are negligible, and then the Senate are zero. And unless there's a two-thirds majority against him, impeachment is off the table in any meaningful way. And he has not gone to Congress when he has controlled Congress. Why would he go to Congress for anything when he doesn't control it?
So, what do you think he does then? Just walks away and lets the rest of the countries? I know Bloomberg just had a story that Europeans are coming to grips with the fact that they may be paying fees because they will be getting their energy from the Middle East.
Yeah, that's the United States, for all intents and purposes, as a government, is now offline. Of the top 6,000 spots in the government, Trump fired them all when he came in. This is legal right, but he only reappointed about a fifth of them. So the leadership apparatus that is required to carry out policy just isn't there. So Trump is just ruling by executive order that may or may not be overruled in court. He's not actually capable of pushing things through the system. And that's before you consider that Congress is basically become non-functional, especially this week, because now we've got some of the really, really robust Trump cheerleaders basically bringing everything to a standstill unless his election bill gets pushed through, something that the leadership in the House and the Senate thinks is a horrible idea. So if Congress is offline, the bureaucracy is offline, we've used half of our long range munitions, just the options that the president has to express his will upon the system really now just comes to monkey wrenches. And so that's exactly what's happening, for example, in the NAFTA talks. We're now on an annual review basis, which basically means that no American manufacturer can make a long term plan for supply chains. And so this steady decline we've seen in manufacturing under Trump 2 is about to fall off a cliff.
So let's get back to the price of oil. This day we've got WTI at 67, Brent a little over 70. Once again, missing 1 billion barrels. It's not going to show up magically. It's likely that the traffic coming out of Hormuz isn't going to be what it once was before the war. So, in your opinion, what are we going to see in oil? I see higher oil prices ahead of us. I don't know
I
about
don't want
you.
to put a number on it because this is just such an unprecedented situation. But yeah, I can't see how it does anything but go up midterm until such time as we either have large scale demand destruction or a vibrant new source of crude, which is usually something that takes a half a decade or more. I don't see another way out of this.
Yeah, and especially with the unfortunate event in Venezuela with the earthquake, not only you losing lives, but as you brought out, if you lose your electrical grid, how are you going to function a refinery or a loading dock or all the things you need to do to move oil?
Yeah, keep in mind that after 20 years of mismanagement in Venezuela and underinvestment, we really still don't have a damage assessment. The people who are producing, excuse me, the crude say the facilities themselves are intact, and I tend to believe them. But there's so much damage in that country from the earthquakes that they just don't know. And digging out is going to take a long time. Getting the power grid back up is obviously one of the first things that needs to be done. But again, 20 years of minimal investment, I don't think that's something that they can turn back on in a matter of weeks. I think we're looking at the remainder of the year at a minimum.
Well, I know the president, when the talks aren't going well, he always throws out the threat, well, I can bomb the heck out of you. What's the likelihood that he would actually do that? Or do you think more likely is just going to walk away and wash his hands of this?
To Iran specifically?
Yes.
Okay, so for the first time ever, I think, this was a non-standard war in terms of standoff distance. In the past, whenever we've had military activity in the Gulf, like, regardless of who the target happened to be, we would park a carrier or two in the Gulf and do close-in strikes. The Trump administration made the decision for a variety of reasons that, considering the drone strength that the Iranians have developed over the last 15 years, that would not be wise. We can debate that decision, but that's what the decision that was made. And so one of the carriers was in the Red Sea, and one of the carriers never even entered the Gulf, was out in the Gulf of Oman. And so most of these strikes were carried out from nearly 1,000 miles away. And that changes the sort of weapons that you bring to bear. Normally, the United States would be flying fighter bombers and dropping things like JDAMs from relatively close proximity, relying on speed and stealth to prevent any sort of attack. But in order to make sure the ships had zero chance of taking a hit, we were using long range missiles and fighters that were flying at a higher altitude and dropping from longer away. That depleted the type of long range munitions that we had been stockpiling for the last 15 years for potential conflict with China, and we used over half of them. In addition, we used over half of our interceptors, specifically the PAC-3s and the THAADs, the good ones that are designed, for example, to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles for attacks on the homeland. So if there is another conflict, regardless of who it is with, we're looking at basically running the stocks dry of our primary long-range offensive and then defensive capabilities. From a strategic point of view, wasting what we wasted on Iran was the height of irresponsibility and stupidity. Doing it a second time, we would need to come up with new words in the English language, because it would basically mean that the United States would lose all capability of fighting a long range conflict. And so if we did get in conflict with a real country like, say, China, we would have to be not within sight of shore or anything that crazy, but we'd have to be very, very close and within a lot of their offensive weapons envelopes, and we would lose ships. So strategically, a second round with Iran is completely off the table. They've already restocked all their drones. That doesn't mean it won't happen, because it's already happened once.
So, given that, I mean, the way it's being portrayed in the media, oh, we won the war. We blew up a lot of stuff in Iran so they can. When you listen to him, he's always talking about we won. Well, if you won, you wouldn't be giving away as much as you are, at least in my opinion. So, do you really think that's the way this plays out? He walks away, but if he does walk away, he leaves a mess. I blew up the sandbox, and now I'm going to go home.
That appears to be the option that we're on. One more thing to throw in there. The Iranian nuclear program never approached having a weapon, because they figured if they had a weapon, they'd be inviting a war. So their idea was, we have this program that makes minimal progress year on year on year for 30 years, and that's our deterrent. Well, now they know that's wrong. So now they have no choice but to build a nuke. So if we do just withdraw, they'll have a nuke in under a year. So that's another problem for just over the horizon. But yes, that appears to be the path that we're on. The people who understand how energy politics works, how energy shipments and logistics works, they're not even allowed into the room. Trump isn't getting briefed by them. He's got a defense secretary who is, let's be kind, an idiot. And he shuts the one person who actually has some concept of how the world works, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, NSA, out of the room, and only allows him into the White House from time to time. So it's just there's no meaningful debate happening within the White House.
One of my guests is friends with some high-level military people, and they said usually before going into a conflict, there's war games. Let's do some war games. How various scenarios, how would they play out? What would we do? How would we respond? None of that was done prior to going in there.
Netanyahu came in the morning of February 11th. The afternoon of February 11th, the carriers were dispatched. That was it.
That was the war game.
That was the war game. Trump swallowed Netanyahu's analysis hook, line, and sinker, and then never even bothered to run a backup check.
Wow. So, in my estimation, I think we're looking at higher oil prices. I'm like you, I'm not going to estimate how high they're going to be. We've got people that are in the industry and Exxon and Chevron saying that it's going much, much higher. So, but I don't think we're going to 50, 60, or going to remain at 50 or $60
I
oil
do
here.
find it interesting that all the oil companies, the ones who live and breathe the logistics of production and shipment, are in a bit of a panic. But
Yep.
the financial houses are like, oh, we're in a glut. And it's like,
You know, it's amazing because it's the IEA put out, we call them the missing barrels. Last year, they said we were producing 2 million barrels more a day than we consume. Well, the logical question is if you're producing more than you're consuming, where does that inventory show up? And it wasn't showing up anyplace. So we call it the missing barrels thesis. And that's what the financial markets are going for. If you read the Wall Street Journal, oh, we're going to go back to a glut. We're going to be flooded by oil. I just don't see it.
Well,
So,
in their defense, there are a lot of reserve systems, whether commercial or government, that are not reported. So 2 million barrels a day for a period as little as a year can vanish into the couch cushions, so to speak. But when you start from a billion shortage and the production remains offline and the tankers can't even get to port, you're in a very different situation that, yes, I don't think that the financial papers are absorbing.
so I guess we'll have to see what's going to happen, but the likelihood is they're going to walk away. It's going to be somewhat of a mess. Europe will have to figure out, or some other powers will have to figure out how they're going to work this out, but we walk away from this. What does that do for the US prestige?
I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last year, U.S. prestige has kind of taken a hit from 1,000 different places, mostly originally in the White House. Um, I am not one of those people who is big on the national or as a tool of policy. That's a very, very French invention. I'm more concerned with capability and maintenance. Capability has now been reduced and the maintenance has stopped. So I'm right now, my big panic is what's going to happen with NATO, because without NATO, the United States couldn't have fought this war in Iran in the first place because we required their facilities in order to get everything into place. We're potentially, with this Turkey summit that's just around the corner, it appears that Trump is set to just leave the alliance. And if that happens, we are a purely Western hemispheric power.
Wow. Well, listen, as we close, Peter, tell our listeners about you've written a number of books, geopolitical ones, but the new one, tell us about that. That's somewhat different from
It
things
is
you've done in the
very
past.
different. Let me see if I can bring up the cover here. I don't know how well that's going to go.
Yeah,
Anyway,
acceptable
Acceptable
range.
Range is the new one. So my nonfiction work has been about how deglobalization and demographics are going to remake the world, and how we deal or not deal with that determines basically our future for the next several decades. Acceptable Range is that same premise against a fictional plot line that involves tech and manufacturing and raw commodities and superpower rivalry, all from the point of view of somebody who has to run around in the middle of it. So I had a blast writing it, and my editor liked it so much he immediately signed me up for a couple more. Book 2 just went to primary edit. Book 1 publishes at the end of this year.
Well, listen, Peter, as always, it's a pleasure speaking with you. I look forward to reading your book when it comes out.
All right.
To speak with our financial planning and wealth management team, visit us on our website, financialsensewealth.com. If you aren't already a subscriber to our weekday podcast and would like to listen to more of our content throughout the week, go to Financial Sense and hit the subscribe button.